LAWsome by Consultwebs. Breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm with your host, Tanner Jones.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another LAWsome interview. Today on the show, we're talking with Bim Dave, Executive Vice President, Products and Services at Helm 360, a company that optimizes systems, data, and processes specifically for legal and professional services. Bim has 20 years of experience in the legal software world, spanning technical support, support team management, all the way to global technical services, strategy, and execution. Today's topic is around new technologies for lawyers and the danger of over-customization. Welcome, Bim. Thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you for having me, Tanner. It's great to be here.
So let's just jump right in. As at Consultwebs, who hosts the LAWsome Podcast, we're a digital marketing agency, and we know that a website or a marketing plan, content, literally everything in between can be fully customized to fit the individual law firm's needs. That means that in most instances, we have the expertise and the resources to build just about anything a law firm desires. Much like you, I'm sure. But that level of customization doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be effective or even generate positive results. So it's safe to say that there's a risk in over-customizing something. More doesn't always mean better. Would you agree with that, Bim?
Yeah, absolutely. I think based on my experience, and which is largely in the large kind of ERP rollouts for law firms, one of the common things that we see time and time again is really around people moving from an old system who are comfortable with that system, who've used it for many, many years, are accustomed to a way of working, right? So when they're moving to a brand new platform, what they have as kind of the baseline for that is really what they started with in the old system that they may have been using for 10, 20 years prior. So really, when they come to the table to really design solutions on a new platform, what they're thinking is my old system did it a certain way. Now I need to reinvent that in the new platform, right? And not really thinking about what the new platform does out of the box, and sometimes not even exploring that, right? So really, what ends up happening is you kind of go down this horrible path of reinventing your old system in the new platform you've just purchased, and that's usually like one of the common starting points as to where things can go wrong.
Well, I've lived through that personally, and it's not fun. But I'm excited about this conversation in particular, but I think it's going to be relatable to all of us. Obviously, technology is all around. It creates a lot of perceived opportunities and potential, but there are pitfalls if you're not considering the whole impact, if you will. And so you've given an example here, Bim, of firms using, let's say legacy software and obviously built standards, SOPs, standard operating procedures around that, and transferring to a new software they try to bring over the old in that process. Are there any other examples that law firms are dealing with respect to over customizing technology today?
I would say also from a business process perspective, like we often come across scenarios where we're really trying to over-engineer a process, right? From a technology perspective, to try and make something more efficient. But in the process of doing that, especially when you're dealing with kind of new technology or new technology to a firm, sometimes what can happen is you build a solution that's so rigid and so kind of customized, highly customized, that when you actually get to the rollout side of things, that can have a negative impact in terms of user adoption, because really what you're doing is you're kind of narrowing the scope of what the functionality of that product can do by putting so many checks and balances in place that actually has like the opposite impact of what you want. So really, it's kind of a balance, right? It's a bit of a balance between what do you need the solution to do, what do you want the kind of business process adjustments to kind of look like in terms of improvements of efficiency, making sure things like, write-off approval limits are not only in place, but also easy to configure later on, right? And not necessarily needing to bring in a developer to then, apply new limits and different workflow rules, but making it simple and easy to be able to deploy something that can then be configurable later on down the road is really, really the key part of it. But I would say, that kind of over-engineering of business process is often something that we see as well.
That's interesting. And you started down this path, at least with respect to, challenges or problems that firms will inevitably deal with in over customizing software. Can you talk through problems that you've experienced in working with law firms in this process?
Yeah, definitely. I think the starting point really is just when you think about an implementation of a new law firm ERP solution, there's quite a lot to kind of cram in an implementation period, right? So typically it can range from anything from like 6 months to 2 to 3 years for big global law firms. And really what ends up happening is that you've got to think about all of the kind of different impacts that that project is going to have on the team. So the first thing that is obvious is that you're going to increase the amount of complexity that's going to go into that project, right? Even with some of the small customizations that customers think that they have, when you actually combine them all together and you kind of add them all up, actually what you're doing is you're implementing a lot of change on top of a core product solution that then needs to be tested, right? And that's really the next kind of impact area, because one of the common things we see is law firms often underestimate the amount of user acceptance testing they need to do on a solution just as it comes out of the box. Because when you think about a new product and implementing a new product, it's obviously providing a baseline of functionality that's there out of the box. But the big difference and the thing that most vendors will not be able to test for is your data sitting within that product, right? So what you really want to be able to do is spend your time testing the data coming into the product and the outcomes of the data from every core business process that you have within your organization, and just basic things like being able to record time all the way through to generate a bill that actually makes sense and is going to look good when you send it out to your clients and can be delivered to your clients efficiently. Those are the things that you really want to be spending time on, right? And it really comes down to kind of data validation and really, really focusing on that area. But when you introduce a level of customization into the mix, what you're then doing is you're having to look at your data. You're also having to look at the core kind of business functions that that product is allowing you to do. And you have to test all of that stuff as well. And that can have a big impact. And really when you look at the kind of impact that that has from a people perspective, it can often be quite frustrating, right? One of the things that we've seen time and time again with some of the big law firms that kind of go down this path is that you will almost have like a development stream that's happening alongside the implementation to implement these customizations. And then what ends up happening is that with any kind of software development, even if you have the best programmer in the world, there are going to be mistakes in the first delivery. I mean, we've all experienced it with our Apple devices, Apple software updates that get deployed to our mobiles, and we think it's going to be an amazing experience, but there's bugs, right? There's going to be software bugs that you uncover. And when you deal with that while you're dealing with all of the aspects of change that are happening with a new big ERP solution, that can have a very negative impact on staff morale. It also leads to really a lack of attention around testing, because if for the first time I'm looking at a product and I'm running through my business processes and I'm seeing typos on the form, or I'm seeing that an error message pops up when I click the bill button, really what that's going to do is it's going to impact me in a negative way. So I'm going to start to lose confidence in the product, and I'm not going to spend as much time, because really what I'm doing is a bug fixing exercise and bug finding exercise at that point, versus what I really should be focused on, which is core, does the product do the business process that I'm trying to test in an efficient and elegant way? So I think that testing effort is really, really a big part of it, and really a big problem that we see. The kind of next thing that I would probably mention is around performance, because again, as you're introducing new code into the mix that may do weird and wonderful things that improve business process and may give you more features and more bells and whistles, often what can be not thought through is really what impact does that have on performance, right? Because now what you're doing is you're taking a product that is designed to do X, Y, Z, you're adding an ABC element into it, which may not have been tested at scale. And really that's another big area where you can often underestimate the impact of that. And the worst thing about that is that you often don't find out until it's too late, right? So you click the go live button, you have all of your 1,000 fee earners sitting on your system globally, and then all of a sudden it grinds to a halt. And when you start to look at what's actually caused that, it could just be one customization where somebody hasn't really thought through the filters that need to be applied to a query. And when you run that alongside all of the other stuff that's happening at the same time, things fall apart, right? So it's really making sure that that thought process is going into it. And it's not to say that there isn't a solution for that, because obviously you can performance test and you can kind of do those kind of things to mitigate some of that risk. But fundamentally, you've got to be aware of the fact that that will have a knock-on impact to performance, or could have a knock-on impact to performance. So it needs to be considered. And then, going back to my days when I was working within the support environment at Thomson Reuters, one of the things that we often faced was around the impact that a customization could have on data, right? So data corruption, for example. So if you have a badly designed customization where you haven't thought through all of the impacts as to, what happens if there's something that happens from a systems perspective, right? So maybe you have a space condition that's met where you run out of space, and then that has a negative impact. If for example, you haven't thought through the transactional flow, you haven't got the right recovery mechanisms in place from a code perspective, then fundamentally you could lead to data corruption, which is another horrible situation to be in, because then it means unraveling core financials in some cases to be able to get to a point where you can then be in balance again. And then the final element is really around upgrades, right, and future scope, because once you go onto a system, it becomes a little less streamlined when it comes to then taking new product versions. And when you've made a big investment in a legal ERP solution, really what you want to be able to do is keep up with the features that are coming out from that product vendor, right? Because often part of your support maintenance that you're paying on an annual basis is really going towards that product development, right? To make sure that you're getting the best of that solution as it moves forward. And when you customize and you have that customization layer involved, really those upgrades become a lot harder to implement, because really what you've then got to do is effectively do a whole regression test of all of your components that sit on top of that platform to enable you to be able to be in a position to kind of upgrade to the new version cleanly. So you almost end up doing like another mini implementation project to be able to get to just the point where you can upgrade a solution.
You're hitting on so many aspects that ultimately save, if firms are proactive in this effort, you're going to save yourself significant time and headaches within the office. You've referenced, Bim, a couple times the ERP solutions. Just for any listeners who are not familiar with that acronym, can you explain what you're referring to there?
Yeah, so I think in the legal space, it's probably more referred to as a business management solution, but it's really all of the aspects that make up your kind of time entry, your billing, your financials, all of those pieces of the table. And then from an acronym perspective, it's the whole resource planning aspect of what you do as an organization. So all of those pieces.
Changing gears slightly here. Obviously, technology is rapidly evolving. We live in a very fast-paced world, technology world in particular today, and it's transforming how law firms are managing and operating their businesses. And because of this, all the digital tools that law firms are leaning on or have embraced naturally need to be updated from time to time. So I'm curious, based on your experience, Bim, how can law firms avoid falling into the trap of over customization of their systems, their data, and or their software, rather than just simply adapting to new trends that are present?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that it starts with user engagement, right? So right from the very beginning, before you've even started the planning exercise of putting a new product in, it's really making sure that you are engaging with the users from the outset, because part of the battle is really just understanding, right? It's really understanding the approach and defining the approach up front, communicating the approach so that everybody is on the same page in terms of we're going to go through a sequence of events that's going to get us to a destination that makes sense to everybody. And it starts with, some discovery, then moves on to like an implementation phase. We then go live, and then you still get an opportunity to customize, but it's going to happen after that, right? In separate streams, once you've got a stable product that's doing the basics of what we need as an organization up and running. So it's really the explanation of that message that it's not a no, we're not going to do this. It's not now. We're going to do it later, right? And we're going to do it in a structured way. We're going to do it in an agile way so that it's less change in one big bang to really allow you to be successful. And then I think the other key component, and this kind of touches on the user engagement piece, is making sure that there's key stakeholders that are aligned to each business area that you're kind of focused on from an implementation standpoint, and forming a steering committee of those members so that they have a voice, right? So really, once you get those people engaged on the project from the beginning, and they understand the vision, they understand what the kind of approach to being successful is, it makes it much easier for that to then disseminate through the business, and ultimately, keep people informed, so that they don't go down that path of ultimate change. Or even if they do start thinking about what they want to achieve, they're kind of putting it on a wish list, right? And that wish list will become a reality at some point, but not until after the first phase of the project is complete.
I think that's a key point, from my limited experience in transitioning software and making big changes within an organization. Those key stakeholders are critical. They're critical to gain early buy-in within the organization. And oftentimes, you've probably heard the concept of junk in, junk out, with respect to data and software. But if the whole organization, the whole law firm is not bought in on the change or the new software, it will inevitably fail, or at least it will have inevitable challenges with that. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there.
You have significant experience, over 20 years of experience in the legal profession, seemingly always focused on digital tools and how to make processes more efficient for businesses and organizations. So to offer our listeners some solid guidance to avoid mishaps or even bad decisions, what's the most common mistake law firms make when deciding to go forward with a new technology?
I think it's really not understanding the problem that they're trying to solve with the technology. So often when we're looking at new technology, or we have a salesperson come in to talk to us about the technology offering that they have, it's very easy to kind of get distracted with the kind of new shiny thing that has a buzzword associated with it. Like AI is a great example of that, right? Where you could come in and you could say, well, we're going to apply AI to our organization and it's going to solve all of our problems. But really, we still need to take a step back, right? And I think one of the mistakes that we see time and time again is not really fully understanding the problem definition. Like, what are we actually going to solve by implementing a new technology, and making sure that everybody is bought into that concept. And secondly is really defining a return on investment, right? Because ultimately, when you're buying something and you're making an investment in a product, you really want to understand, what is that going to do for my organization, right? Is it efficiency gains? Is it going to save me money? Is it going to make me future proof? Like whatever those return on investment measures are, it's important to define those prior to purchasing, so that you know that that's really what's going to drive the project forward. And then really make that part of your tracking as well, because if you know that the product that you're buying is designed to allow your lawyers to be more efficient, then put measurements against that, see how you can track it, and make sure that actually the reality is that those things are coming into play, and that you are achieving what you wanted to achieve. Because what that allows us to do is then pivot where necessary, because no technology project is going to be super smooth, right, at the end of the day. And some of these variables can change, but unless you have that baseline intent and understanding as to where you want to be, really it becomes very difficult to just keep pivoting along a project to get to a successful point when you don't know what success looks like, or what you're aiming for. So that definition of success is super important. There's an example that I just want to share as well on this, which kind of exemplifies this particular mistake that can happen. Where I was working with a law firm, and they had about 600 or 700 lawyers scattered around the globe. And they spent, a fair amount of money building a BI dashboard, business intelligence dashboard, which they thought would really give their lawyers a bit more of an insight in terms of how their financials look, being able to get their client information a little bit more seamlessly, and just see how they're doing according to their targets, right? And they rolled out this amazing dashboard. There was actually nothing wrong with the dashboard. Like, I looked at the dashboard and looked pretty good. Usual metrics you would expect to see, your build hours, what your billing realization is, all of the usual stuff that you would expect to see on a fee earner dashboard. And what was interesting is, out of those 600 or so users that were across the globe, what they did was they did an assessment of how many people were actually using the product after 3 months of implementing it. And Tanner, can you guess how many people were actually using the product on an ongoing basis out of that 600?
Less than half?
8 users.
Oh, wow.
8 users consistently. And that kind of tells you the story, right? And we hear that time and time again, that we think we've solved a problem, but actually we haven't, because if your user adoption is that low, then fundamentally you're not really solving a problem that needed to be solved in the first place, right? So I thought that was a good example.
That's powerful. And that goes back to the buy-in concept. Clearly they didn't have enough key stakeholders to push the mission, to push the why behind it. And that's so valuable. We can learn a lot from that mistake if we just listen. So, these 2 decades, I'm curious, I want to step back in time a little bit. If you can reflect back on the early years in your career 20 years ago, and technology adoption in legal, how that looked, and law firms' willingness to jump into new technologies in an effort to make a better business, to run a more productive or efficient business. What has that history looked like, from 20 years ago to today? Do you find that law firms are more resistant to this type of change, less resistant? What does that look like?
So when I first started my journey in legal technology when I was a young lad, it was a very different, I think it was a very different landscape in terms of what technology a firm would typically deploy. So what I would typically come across is a firm that would have really a single system that would do a lot of the core fundamentals that a law firm would need, and it would be really focused around time, billing, and financials, right? And that's pretty much it. So all of the other stuff was pretty manual in those days. And what's happened over the years is that those systems have become more complex, right? Because really what most firms have done is they've kind of taken a step back when they're making their product selections. And what they've looked at is they've looked at various products that do specific functions very, very well, and really gone with this kind of best of breed solution approach to selecting products. And what that's done over the years is it's kind of changed the dynamic of the complexity of a law firm, because really now it's that they've got 17 different products that do everything in their own right really, really well. But then really the challenge becomes integration, right? How do they all talk to each other? How does that translate into a good user experience? So going back to the question though, around resistance to change, I would say over the years, the kind of clients that we've been dealing with are much more acceptable to change. Like I think they want to see progress, and I think a lot of that has come about from what we do in our personal lives, right? And the kind of technology interactions we have on our phones and on our tablets. We've almost become accustomed to a better user experience, right? Whatever we do. And what we've seen happen with law firms is that in the old days, we used to have customers that would be running like on a Unix, Linux platform, and there would be no UI. It would just be a form that they just literally use their keypads to kind of get through, and they could generate a bill and they could do whatever they want in record time because there was no kind of UI to deal with. And as time has gone on, obviously that's changed because our kind of expectation level has changed in terms of how quickly we expect something to respond from a systems perspective. Because if I can pick up my phone and I can send an email within 10 seconds of picking up the phone, why can't I do a similar kind of action in my business enterprise? Right? Why can't I do that internally, and why can't it look good when I'm doing it? Why does it need to look like an antiquated, corporate system from the 1990s? Like, it should look good. It should be a good user experience. It should be seamless. And I shouldn't need to think about, as a user, I shouldn't be able to think about, do these systems connect in the background? Like, that should just happen seamlessly, right? So I think the kind of acceptance to change is kind of evolving, right, to a point where the end users want to kind of drive the change. They can see that that's going to bring an easier way of working for them, efficiency gains, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that there's still a dynamic in most law firms that we see depending on the kind of background of the lawyer. So you kind of have some lawyers that are very traditional thinkers, right? So they're excellent lawyers, but they're used to having the piles of paper on their desktop to kind of sign off things and mark up things to hand off to somebody to then process in a system. So you still have that element of dynamic, and we find that those kind of end users can be a little bit more challenging to kind of convince that new technology is a good thing. But usually if you take them down the path in small bite-sized chunks, you can get them there. But it's really investing the time in and understanding that kind of dynamic might be slightly different for that kind of user. And then on the flip side, you get the other type of user that's a little bit more advanced and they want everything now, right? And that's another problem to kind of overcome, because maybe the rate of change that you want to put in place doesn't really serve every user that you have within the law firm. So it's really make sure you understand what the distribution of kind of age ranges is, because that can influence like how you roll out technology as well, how much investment you make in terms of training and hand holding and making sure you've got somebody sitting by their side to make sure it's successful. All of those things can kind of change the dynamic when it comes to user engagement.
For law firms and listeners in particular here who may be going through the process of implementing new software. Maybe they've even hired a tech consultant or a group like Helm 360 to walk them through this process. Is there something they need to be aware of going into that process to help them make better decisions to ensure successful implementation? What advice would you share?
I think the number one piece of advice I would say is out there is to start early. Right, start talking early. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to make a selection on which vendor to work with for any piece of the project that you need to consider, but it's very, very important to start early and plan ahead. And really, that comes about with any kind of major change that you're doing to your environment. And often, what we get kind of called in to do is really help with the planning process, right? So we can come in, be a business advisor, help to kind of develop a technology roadmap for a firm so that it becomes something that's much easier to kind of put the wheels in motion and put the right building blocks in place to make sure that your end goal is really, really smooth. So great example is around, again, going back to kind of ERP migrations and how that kind of translates into a successful migration is around the data, right? And when we work with firms at the moment, what we tend to really focus them on is the data element of it, because that's kind of the crown jewels of the system, right? That's where all of your client data is, all of your billing information is. So you should really be investing quite a lot of time in that aspect of it to make sure that the data goes from A to B very smoothly and that the data is in a good place to start with. So often what we're doing with firms is working with them on data cleansing, integrity checking, making sure that that baseline of data looks good so that before you even start to hit the start button on the implementation process, you're really getting all of your ducks in a row. You're understanding how you're using the system today. You're understanding the weaknesses, right, in terms of where the data integrity issues might be. Because as you mentioned before, junk in is going to be junk out, right? So really, and that plays a big part in terms of your financial data. Especially with these kind of migrations, like you really want to make it as easy as possible to kind of take that data out and put it into a new system. So putting the right tooling against that, like we have a product called Digital Eye, which kind of helps with some of that stuff, which is really going out and doing data discovery, making sure that you understand where you are in balance or where you're not in balance. It's not necessarily an issue, but it's knowing what your starting point is, right? So that when it gets to the point of data conversion, you're all really focused on how does this system map to the new system versus, are my addresses correct? Or, are my telephone numbers correct? Like all of that kind of stuff around client data can be cleansed and addressed much, much before the implementation starts.
Yeah, and Bim, even with the best planning, and I agree, starting early, having conversations early will naturally, start the wheels turning and will create opportunities or topics to talk through and discuss internally as a law firm. But even with the best plans, I think you would agree with me, sometimes there are unforeseen problems or challenges that arise. Certainly problems such as dissatisfied clients can arise, especially if you decide, for example, not to customize something the way they're requesting. Communication is arguably key in that, and proactive communication. So by understanding the process and knowing that good results will be generated with certain decisions, a client can be confident that the company is ultimately following that right path. You alluded earlier to sometimes the answer is no, not right now, but later. So I'm curious, how would you advise communication be with clients during an integration process or working through new technology? Should certain key points be communicated to clients beforehand? What's your experience there?
Yeah, I think transparency is key, and communication needs to happen before, during, and after any kind of technology change. And I think the before is probably the most important piece of communication that needs to happen, because that's where you can lay out the plan and, most importantly, make them feel like they're part of the journey, right? So I think the communication is absolutely key. The message around, it's not a no, it's a later thing, right? We're just kind of pushing it for a later conversation, is very important to kind of lay out before we get into the depths of the project. Because when you're in that kind of mindset of implementation and you're constantly thinking about the old system, you're not going to do yourself justice by not bringing them into the kind of plan, like the master plan beforehand. So I think making sure that that's happening is really key, and communicating the fact that actually what we're going to be doing is making it easier for us to consume the change, right? So we're still doing changes, but we're going to do it later on. And when we do it, we're going to do it in small incremental improvements. That's not just a one-off improvement, it's going to be ongoing improvements for the life of the product, right? So really every month, you could do a release cycle, for example, which brings in a change that's going to be a positive change, but it's going to be a more realistic change, and it's probably going to be a change that's actually necessary. Because if you think about any of these kind of implementations and you kind of run with a product for 3 months, 6 months to begin with, as it is as vanilla as possible, like out of the box, you usually will either become accustomed to the way that it's working, right? So you'll kind of adapt your business processes to work within the confines of the product, in which case a lot of those things that you thought you needed are no longer needed anymore. And then you're really focusing your attention on true changes that actually are going to make a material impact to the way that you use the product going forward. And I think that's going to be a really key, overall impact in terms of how you kind of have a successful implementation.
Makes sense. I'm curious, can you recall any particular experiences you've had around, difficulties with a customer because of this concept? And if so, can you speak to how you work through that?
Yeah, so there's a firm, there's a global law firm that I worked with, who obviously I won't mention their name, but we went through an implementation cycle with them a few years ago. This is when I was at Thomson Reuters, and what was very interesting about this client was that they kind of went down the road, the correct road to begin with, which was, we want stakeholders involved. They had the steering committee set up, so everything was kind of aligned correctly to be able to have a successful outcome. And we were working with one managing partner in particular, who was very vocal about how he wanted the billing process to work, right? And he wanted his team to be very engaged in the billing process. They wanted to be part of the workflow. They wanted to be part of the design of the workflow. They wanted to design the forms so they would be really easy and intuitive for them to use. And he was involved all the way through, and fair play to him. Like, he was very involved and very vocal, and made some really good decisions in terms of what this workflow looked like. Now, we got through the implementation, and they spent a fair chunk of money customizing, the product to do what they wanted it to do. About 3 months later, I went and did a check-in with them, just to see how things are going. And I asked the managing partner, how's your workflow? The thing that you spent most of your time on. And he said to me, Bim, to be honest with you, the product is amazing. Like, we love the product. It's changed, our organization. We're really happy with it. But my team doesn't use that. And I was like, why? You spent so much time, you spent the best part of a year customizing this thing, probably spent, hundreds of thousands of dollars in customization time and resource to be able to do that. And he said, when it came down to it, when I went into the product and tried to do an approval, by the time I went through the process and clicked the buttons to get there, it was much easier for me, and it saved my time to be able to send an email to my secretary and I would get them to do it for me. And it was much faster for me to do it that way. So really what it came down to was, the solution was great. Like, it did what it said on the tin, but fundamentally it didn't address his problem, right? And his problem was efficiency, and really he was there to practice law and not necessarily to click through a workflow to get to the end game, right? And he didn't know that at the time. We didn't know that at the time, but we found out, the hard way at the end of the day, right? That really that user experience has to balance out with the kind of customizations that are being put in for it to really have an impact and have a material impact in terms of the user adoption.
And being flexible, having a mindset that, where you set out may not always be that final destination. Having the mindset of flexibility and adaptability will serve the firm and yourself very, very well. Bim, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Any final advice that you would leave our listeners that we haven't touched on today?
I think I would just focus on what we just talked about really, and which is really think about the user experience. I think that's often underestimated in terms of how much of an impact that can have. And when you think about all of the best of breed systems that you have in place, really think about what does it actually take for a user to be able to interact with those systems, to use them meaningfully in the most simplest way, right? And sometimes simple is better than complicated.
Agreed. Bim, what's the best way for our listeners to reach out to you?
The easiest way to reach out is helm360.com.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Bim. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Tanner.
LAWsome by Consultwebs with Tanner Jones. For show notes, links, and info, go to consultwebs.com/podcast. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Watch for the next LAWsome episode to discover more breakthrough insights to build a thriving law firm.